So hello everybody, this is Anto. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something we do every Monday. You know where all our profiles are and that our views are personal, not of any company or organization. You know how to use the tools, and this deck is on the website as well, mondaylive.org. This month we're focused on smart building enablers, what enables smart buildings. And our agenda today, our normal chit chat, see where that goes, and then we're going to talk about taming complexity. Really, because this word complexity and complication comes up a lot in our conversation, so we thought we'd pick this up and see where it goes. Before that, Ken, you're still pushing dinosaurs.
Yep.
So are they going where you want them to go?
Well, as always, if I stop talking about building automation, I get way more reads. So that's worked out pretty well. Actually, we've had good interaction. We had our article in Connected Contractor, Driving and Dodging Digital Dinosaurs, and we posted that on LinkedIn. We got about 1,500 views. And as my daughter quips, Jurassic times we call for Jurassic measures. I don't know if you remember in the Jurassic period that's when birds started to learn how to fly, and I think maybe that's where we are as an industry. We're just starting to learn how to fly. And James Dice, who couldn't be with us today, following some of his stuff, and we were chatting back and forth about the power of windshield time. And for him, that was when you're trapped in a car with somebody going somewhere and you have this amazing conversation because you have their undivided attention, 300 miles or something like that. And I also pointed out the advantage of canceled air travel and things like that. But we also talked that when these dinosaurs hit the windshield, they're messy. So there's some real variances in thought these days, and it's good to follow out some of his thinking and some of his people, because he has actually a whole network of folks that are thinking quite differently, and I applaud their thinking. And then the other one we did is we posted a need for AI first strategies. And of course, this is from our contributing editor, Nicholas. And we chatted about the AI economy, and he's still concerned about that. It's an interesting idea. AI is so powerful that we need to actually get it up there first in the design, because it radically changes the design. Just simple things about the way things are done, if we know how it's going to be used, even if maybe it's not even artificial intelligence, maybe it's just added intelligence, maybe what AI stands for. So some interesting things there. He also relates that to how important mnemonics are, and how we basically organize all of that. So based on all of that, we're now thinking about our July theme, and it's going to be called Navigating the Next New. And what I want you all to do is help me discover what the next new is, and how we can best discover it, understand, and make it part of our next solution. And how do we purchase what has not been invented yet? And how do we navigate uncharted waters? It'll be fun. Jump in. Our industry's own Shark Tank.
I don't know about the last Shark Tank bit.
Well, it certainly is uncharted water.
That is true, yes. So John is not with us, but he gave us a couple of links here. One talking about the maddening persistence of hygiene theater. We talked about this all the way at the beginning of the Monday Live, right? We had quite a lot of discussion about theater in terms of what people were going through in terms of people coming into buildings. Anybody have any views on this?
Yeah, the second one was interesting. I actually read that earlier in the day. It's actually an interesting article about even though the models changed and people are doing remote, the actual the number of companies actually expanding their portfolios is actually more than expected, which is really interesting. So they're still not sure what the logic is behind it. If it's just their expansion, you know, you work, new businesses, new opportunities, or whatever, or are they just thinking that more people will want to come back than they previously thought?
Yeah, continuing unknowns.
It seems like there's two lines of thinking. There seems like there's a whole camp which is suggesting that it's going to be okay or better, and then there's the other ones that are saying it's going to radically change. So I'm not sure who to believe.
Well, we'll find
Something
out.
in between.
Yeah, probably right.
Anno. Yeah, two interesting articles, and I will tell you, I'm not being subsidized by either one of them, but they are interesting. The first one was actually an article by JLLT, the new technology group out of JLL. Interesting take on their perspective that, you know, the off-the-shelf BI type platforms don't cut it, which is interesting because that's been a platform and an angle that you know, a lot of the real estate companies have been touting for a long time, right? It's just an IT problem, and we just plonk BI on top of that. We're good to go. And yet JLLT's commissioned this article to say that no, that's not good enough. Interesting from a couple of perspectives. One is they commissioned the report. Two, that the findings lines up with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about over this last year and over the last time as well. That, you know, someone like a JLLT is recognizing that a standard BI is not enough to do everything that you need to do, and you know, it's a decent job at it too. I quite liked it. The second one was Smart Score. If you hadn't listened in this morning, they had a webinar this morning, sort of announcing the Smart Scores thing. Interesting discussion. Part of where they focused on was that they really focused on this outcome-based approach, right? Having discussions about what are you trying to do? What are you solving with the whole smart building initiative? What's the objectives? You know, what are the outcomes that you're looking for? And one of their takes, I think, and we talked about a little bit about this last week, about, you know, there's enough technology out there to solve it. People are probably more confused about what it is you're trying to do rather than the technology that's solving it. It was an interesting take on it.
Yeah, I was on that. I listened to it as well, and most definitely interesting. And while they've got, one of my observations of many was, while they've got some decent global supporters, let's just call them supporters, there was not one building technology solution provider on there as a supporter.
Yeah, good point, actually, Mark.
Yeah, and you heard, that was the question I asked, obviously. You heard that one. And the answer that was given was that they're trying to keep it neutral. They didn't want any influence from a technology building provider, which, you know, for this group, sorry, I don't buy that. You know, anyway, so that was, for me, the fact that there are no building technology providers, whether you be an OEM or an integrator, it doesn't matter. That I think, you know, is just to be questioned.
If it's a Mark, with today's theme, I understand your logic there, and with today's theme of complexity and how that's either driving or holding back the industry, I could almost see the conversations. Of course, I have no part of it, but going, gosh, if we start bringing these people in, does that give us a complexity level when we really want to focus on the overall outcome? I don't know what their logic was, but I could start to create some logic of my own where it starts to get complex when you start to bring in the technologists, in a sense.
Does it, or do you need the technologist to be able to deliver, in this particular case, the smart score, okay? Without
Absolutely.
the technologist, without the building industry providers, who's going to do it? In other words, if my systems, your systems, or whosoever, so.
I get it. And there's a thing about let's figure out the being, the doing will come later. But I hear you.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, Mark.
So this, I think, goes to number 2 of John's previous slide there. The fact that office landlords are hurrying to renovate buildings amid workers' return. And, I found this kind of enlightening and encouraging, to be perfectly honest with you. And in particular, major renovation permits in New York City were issued at a rate of approximately 16% higher than the quarterly average data for the past 10 years. And, I'm hearing mixed messages, are in and around New York, that people are not coming back, but I'm reading this and, okay, landlords are spending money to renovate buildings and, do everything they can to attract the folks back. So I find that encouraging. So,
Yeah.
and I think this bodes well for everybody on the phone here and all of us in this business.
Yeah, that is encouraging. It reminds me, Mark, of when I took an early flight during the pandemic. Maybe it was midsummer last year. I had to go somewhere, and the Atlanta airport was like completely being renovated. I'm like, that's like they know something we don't know. This stuff, New York City is not going away. It's not going away.
In fact, I'm looking at going there for Christmas. I'll be honest with you, with my family. So
I think you could pick up a cheap condo there now.
This is true. Yeah, New York is not going anywhere. That's not a bad thing. Okay, and before we jump into taming complexity, anybody else have any unrelated issue, news, or any trends? Otherwise, we move on. Okay, so just sort of the rationale behind this is that it seems that when I look at conversations that we've had on Mondays and also the Wednesday calls that we have just to chit chat amongst ourselves, quite often we get to a point where we're saying it's complex because it's complex. Why can't you do something because it's complex or because it's complicated? And it seems that we kind of, when we kind of bump up to that word or one of those two words, we kind of freeze, just like the deer in the headlights kind of sort of concept, right? So I thought that was a motivation of having this conversation, and how can we get past that, because we can't just stop when things are complex. And so I looked up what the words mean, just to make sure that we know what it means. Complex is consisting of many different and connected parts. Yeah, that makes sense. And not easy to analyze or understand, complicated or intricate. I'm not sure intricate is the right word, but complicated is the other word. Consisting of many interconnected parts of elements, involving many different and confusing aspects. And I think that probably resonates a lot. So I'm not sure that helps a lot, but I thought this would be sort of a good topic for us to have a conversation with. So what do we all think of being beaten by complexity, basically?
It's interesting what you just put up there. You put 2 slides up with 2 different definition neighborhoods. One of them was systems and machinery, and one of them was human. And so I'll start off by saying, like, that's an interesting place for us to look. We can get into more of that later, but it's interesting, and I appreciate you putting both of those up.
Yeah, that sort of goes to what we were talking about last week, technology in business, and probably the truth is the complexity and applies to both in both areas, right? Especially when it comes to us humans.
We're complicated.
So do you
is
think?
this,
Sorry, go.
I was going to say, from a complexity perspective, is it from, are there different views, I guess, from the building owner perspective versus the technology provider's perspective? Do we think it's complex, or is the perception or the realization in the building owner, operator, facility side, IT side, whatever, that it is complex?
Or is it both,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Or
Sorry.
I was just going to say, are they a different kind of complexity? Obviously, they are. I'm pretty sure.
Well, the other problem is it complex because we make it so? Because I mean, there's other parallel universes where complex is well hidden, right? I mean, the iPhone is the most complex device you could imagine, and they've solved both the business and the technology part. Yeah, no offense to her, but my wife can download an app to do something pretty easily and doesn't need a training manual. She doesn't have to read the training manual to know how to run the app, to understand how to use it, right? So have they done a good job of hiding the complexity or obfuscating the complexity? And we're doing a bad job of trying to tell a complex story.
Or I would, Stephen just made a comment that maybe we are, maybe not purposely, but subconsciously making it more complex.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, Keith's comment. True genius is making the complex seem simple, right?
Yeah.
Einstein, not Keith.
I like Anno's in relation to the mobile first kind of approach is what they do is they kind of take things that are really complex and they break them into small parts and they make it do one thing. Like they make it look at indoor air quality and they don't have to look at the filters. They don't have to look at whether the fans are running backwards and any of that complex stuff that's in our heads. And so almost what happens is our great wealth of experience almost hamstrings us, or we're unable, we've thought so much we're unable to move. The young people come in and they say, well, all we want to do is measure the indoor air quality. I don't really want to get involved in your complex systems. So by breaking it into pieces, I think that's the IT approach. And that's a lot of what I'm thinking navigating the next new is.
Well, and that, by the way, that's interesting perspective, Ken, because in some context, that is also the approach that the IoT guys are taking, right? They're just solving one simple business problem. They're not trying to change the world per se. And hence, you know, they're getting the attention because of that.
But sure, we've all fallen into that. We get on our phone and we do our banking, or we order or reserve a restaurant or call an Uber. We do one thing at a time, and it does it well, and we're amazed with that service. And when we present ourselves to the world, we all say, wow, it's complex. You don't want to come into this briar patch. And
yeah,
it's probably good advice, but it's not good for business.
If you took the analogy, right, like you said, the banking app, you know, for my wife to use the banking app, the analogy would be I'd have to explain to her all the financial institutions and methodologies and transfers and protocols and, you know, interbanking transfers mechanisms. And she goes, no, I just click here and clear. And I said, money.
That's right.
Let me ask a question another way. Are we losing opportunities because we're explaining things to customers in a complex way? Is that what you guys are professing?
I think we end up doing that.
I don't.
Okay.
Price, and if it's complex, the price is higher, and if it's not, the price is lower. Why are we getting into complex conversations about all this stuff with the customers if we know that just makes it harder?
Tracy, you just hit on, in my opinion, one of the key topics for the day: complexity up here, which then comes out here, which then gets received as I can't do anything. Great
Can't
talk.
do
I'd love to
anything, or
hear.
I don't want to do anything.
I don't want to do anything because I don't want to act. I personally don't act unless I've got clarity on my actions. Not can't, don't want to, because I don't have clarity. And as a business person, you kind of want to have clarity of outcomes and all that. And the algorithms all have to work. But when they do, they do.
And
So
to
I
give-
would also, having said that, I understand that, this is complicated and you have to charge more for that. So is the problem that, things cost too much to do then? If it's not that we're ruining it by what we're saying and how we're pitching and talking about our industry and our solutions, is the real complexity causing the real cost to be high an issue?
Which then becomes a different problem.
Ooh.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, but Tracy, is it really complex, or have you not done the homework enough to go find solutions that are not complex and costs have come down? Are we stuck on our old methodologies and modes? And are we unable or unwilling to go find new tech that brings complexity down and cost down?
I think that's very much the situation we're at. Is I'm an old guy and I akin this to pneumatics and DDC. When we brought in DDC, it was like magic, and nobody could get their mind around it. And we kind of went through that whole era, and this is exactly the same thing. Artificial intelligence, mobile first, all of this stuff is a technology that we know about, but we don't design it first. We don't make it part of our product. We don't make it part of our sales pitches. And we need to change our whole approach. We've got to learn how to fly.
But how, right? So Tracy's proposed one way of thinking about it is don't think about it, don't talk about it, just put the price up, or make the price appropriate. That can work. The other sort of thing about the dictionary slides that I put up is that complexity inherently is all, but in both complex and what's the other word I use? Complicated. They're both the way they are because they are made up of lots of different parts. Something is complex when there are lots of different parts.
So let me throw my 2 cents into this discussion. So if you go back to when we made that transition from pneumatics to DDC, so that was the introduction of digital technology into this world, and every company started out trying to define in their world what they considered a point to be. You think about how this whole industry started; it was pointless. And then people put tags on point lists, or created different types of points. And then, but at the end of the day, no matter what that controller was doing, there was an application associated with the points. If there was, then years later, what do we have? We've got Haystack and Brick and other types of things trying to further create some kind of common language around these points, because you've got all these unique siloed or vendor specific definitions of points. And so we'll put an abstract layer on top of that to try to get everybody to agree that this is how you're going to represent that point. So as an enabler, if the entire industry could go back and redefine a point and agree on the way to do it, and that their value is strictly the application they used against the data and not how we represent it. Knowing that the representation model has to be something that can evolve to add different attributes to it. But fundamentally, if there was one common method for representing information that everybody used, and our value was out of the applications and how we delivered those applications in a controller, in a smartphone, in a laptop, or however we deliver it, that's where we would earn our value. But if in fact we could all agree on one way to create data, then all of a sudden anybody could access the data and do something with it. But right now it's all locked up and it's all represented in a huge number of different ways. And that means drivers and APIs and all the other crap that it takes to get access to the data and do so and have it available to you, right? So
the interesting point, Steve, years ago, I remember I was at a conference, I think it was a Realcomm conference or something, and there was the guy there from Duke Energy, was the facilities guy. And I remember he was on one of the panels, and I remember to this day, clearly he said one of the things that really, really irked him was the fact that he kept paying for the same point over and over and over again.
Right.
And his point was, I paid for the point when it was hooked up to the BMS by the BMS guy. Then I paid for the point when it was hooked up to the graphics by the graphics guy. Then I paid for the point when it was connected to the fault detection diagnostics guy. And that was another, thing. Now I'm paying for the point again. I'm paying for the same damn point, multiple times.
There you go. Because everybody creates a separate database for their points.
Right.
And as opposed to just subscribing to the information and having it serve into their application. So it's a big ask, but in terms of what we're talking about, an enabler, that would revolutionize in our entire industry if we could all agree on the way to represent information.
And
that was the promise of BACnet.
is
That was what BACnet was all about. We just didn't get all the way there.
Right.
and Anna, what you just described is our good old US tax structure and what most governments use for their tax bases, right? And therefore, will it ever change, or do they want to keep it as complex as possible?
Right.
Are the large four that control and dominate our industry willing to make it simple? I would argue no. And I'd also challenge this team of panelists that every time we refer back to pneumatics and how it was back in those days and how we transition through this, we lose the millennial generation.
Yeah.
We're not capturing their attention, gentlemen. And that's who's going to drive this industry forward. And that's where we should be looking for some of these answers to how to take the complex and make it simple. And earlier someone brought up, I can't remember who, but the IoT industry is solving just a minor piece. But every time they solve a minor piece, they're putting together one piece to a massive puzzle. And eventually we're going to have, the IoT companies are going to have the whole puzzle. And the BAS industry is going to be left in the dust like pneumatics.
Well, like Steve said, we will become pointless. Sorry.
Yeah, the only thing I would argue, Scott, is that they're going to end up tripping over themselves just like we have. They're just early stage. So all these individual point solutions are ultimately going to have the same problem of paying for the same point numerous times because they've created no standard way of representing information.
Steve, that's not going to change. That is not going to change. That is an inherent part of how business is done today, because you have to monetize your solution. How else do you monetize a solution as a disparate company to that point? You have
that was what I was saying. Your value should be earned by the quality of your application, by the ease of your use, by the way you communicate the information, wired, wireless, securely, non-securely. There's all kinds of other ways to create value other than being the one who defines what a point.
But what if in that process of everything you've just described, you suddenly decide that the best way for you to do that is to define another point?
Right. I hear you. Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It has to be extensible. The way the point is constructed, it has to be extensible, and it has to be something that everybody can discover that extension you've added. So, not saying that.
The reason we came about on points, right, Stephen? Again, to Scott's point about going back in history, is always we lose people when we do this. But I'll go back a second.
Yeah.
But the reason we created points was because that was the place that you landed a sensor on a controller, right? That was the physical IO piece that we landed. That's where it all stemmed from. But I agree with you 100%. I have a terrible time every time I have to talk to a customer and he goes, tell me what a point is again and how do you price it? And describe this for me. And then you're going to go, well, then there's the software point and the hardware point, and blah, 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 blah. I'm with you, man. I mean, we can get away from this damn point model.
Well, I mean, I go back to my beating my same dead horse. A lot of these things are this way because this is the way customers like to procure them. We're still using a 19th century procurement model where the cost of all of these managed services and everything future forward is based on price per point in bid. I mean, it's built into the DNA of what the customers buy. That's why it's very hard for us to change.
I'd like to bring a point up here because back in the old days, again, just one more look at it, is we did not do the point game. We basically, first of all, we called the systems we were buying client comfort systems, which was kind of unique at the time. Secondly, we went out for a request for proposal because the technology was changing so fast. We had no earthly idea what we were buying. And then the next piece of this puzzle was mandatory requirements. We basically spent a lot of times laying out what it was we were trying to do. We were trying to save energy. We wanted to do it this way, that way. We did not necessarily, later on, we actually did come to having a point count, but it was based on the requirements and also the interviewing of these new technology companies and learning from them. Every time we went out for a proposal, then we basically took the good ideas from the last one and made them mandatory requirements. And that's how we grew the DDC industry in Western Canada. And it was a very significant change. I think that for exactly at that same point in time, we need to go out for requests for proposals for these new systems that basically are basically try and figure out what our mandatory requirements are. And that's exercise you'll be amazed at how long that takes to try and figure out with the client, with the folks that are in the building, everybody, what are the mandatory requirements? What is this? What is it this system supposed to do? Is air quality a big portion of it? All of these pieces have to be defined. What do we need to do with the data? And I think what we might find is our systems are kind of being designed from a technology point of view now. And we really need to define them from a customer client use point of view. And we had the advantage of being actually almost inside of the province's 14 million square feet of space or something like that. And that's a lot of our drive was from that. So we had one customer, so it was a little easier, but it did allow us to very much push forward the technology in BC and create companies like Reliable, Delta Controls, a few others you've probably never even heard of.
So Jim, I understand your point about, where we are because purchasing, that's how they purchase systems, right? It's all the purchasing is based around the points. But I guess what we're saying is we can divorce ourselves from the purchasing piece, how you buy it versus what's the messaging that we're putting. The problem that we've got is we've taken the purchasing model and plowed it into the marketing and the story and everything else, right? And that's the separation I think we need to do. Sure, at the end of the day, if purchasing says, how do I buy this thing? And it's based on this arcane point thing, fine. That's purchasing is arcane to begin with. But I think a lot of it has to do is we've carried that whole structure over into the business world. And that's one of the challenges I think Steve's talking about.
It is, I agree. But the question is so how do we logically start to change that?
Yeah.
Right.
And the problem is that with the IoT stuff, I see it out there, but I don't see it challenging these mainstream business philosophies or outcomes. I see the same old practice pertaining. And that actually leads to consulting engineers who, once again, have not just purchasing, but consulting engineers have abdicated their responsibility for figuring out how to adopt new technologies and new models.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Stephen Crow mentioned that a little bit earlier in the stream too, that they were around in the day to make complex things simple for customers. That's their job, right? I mean, that's a lot of part of their job. But now, to your point, they've evaporated in our space, and we're struggling as a result.
Is that because the technology and the landscape has become way more complex than the consulting engineers are capable of, or because they're focused on the wrong thing?
I'd say it is because they don't get paid to think about this. If you look at viewpoints in the industry, it's generally felt that mechanical engineers or building system engineers are there to design ducts and pipes and heat transfer. Mechanical engineering, I'm frequently told that controls are 2% of what they do, so they don't really have a lot of time to spend on it. Problem is, it dictates a far greater percentage of the ongoing operating cost of the building. So this has been a problem for 20 years.
Yeah.
I think it's even worse than that because they get paid on a percentage, and the more complex it is, the more the mechanical contract is and the greater the fee is. It's counterproductive. It's just stupid the way we pay consultants. Absolutely idiotic.
So the question is how do you fundamentally change these things when you have an inertial frame, which is not just North America. The entire world basically has cloned this procurement system. I mean, Anno, you can probably speak to how things work in the Far East, but at the zero with order, it's the same. They might be doing a few more intelligent things on the side, right?
In fact, I actually have a metric that I quote often, and it's what I call the in to out ratio, the inputs to output ratio in BAS systems spec around the globe. And if you look at the IO ratio that we use here in the US versus APAC versus EMEA markets, it's a really interesting tell and as to what people use BAS systems for. Here in the US, my ratio is something like there's about 60-40 inputs to outputs, meaning we do more controls than we do monitoring on BAS systems. You go to the EMEA market, the ins to outs is quite high. You're probably running almost 70-80% ins to outs, meaning they use a lot more of the points for monitoring functionality that produce no control functionality per se. And then APAC is probably in between there somewhere.
So with all this, what questions should we be asking ourselves? And what are the answers? With that, then how do you change the narrative?
Well, let's look at how people have tried to change that narrative over the years, Mark. They've changed it with different vehicles like performance contracting, where people have looked at shared savings models. They've looked at different procurement models for controls. But fundamentally, everything devolves back to the Construction Specification Institute in the same old way, because that's how you do it.
And we have changed it through enabling, okay, as the subject of our month here is all about enablement or whatever. We've done it, but to your point is it all goes back to basically that the Lord of the Rings right there, and if they don't change, I guess.
So I have a question about that. If that's the holdup, the procurement model, does that mean that the alternatives, the simpler approach, the IoT-like, whatever you want to call it, are they able to find their way through that procurement model?
I was going to ask a similar question, Tracy, slightly differently. To be honest, one of the things this has spurred me to do is go see how IoTs do their pricing model and how do they. To be honest, I've not tracked any of that. How do they promote their solution? Is it based on devices, sensors, usage, formula? What is their models? I have no insight into that.
Well, and it kind of depends a little bit about whether you're a software company or you're a hardware company in IoT, right? Are you going to make your money on one or the other, or equally balanced? Or you can give away the hardware and charge for the software, or you can charge and make a profit on the hardware, but give away the monitoring and the software, the recurring revenue part, at a really low price. So,
and where's the real value in all of that? Is it in the data itself, we've said that the true value is in the data itself, not the hardware, not so much the hardware, I guess. in this
And I'm
case.
not sure we've done a good job at bringing that value out, getting that value out of the data into the customer's hands. You know, there are certain industries and examples that are quite clearly exceptions to what I just said, but as a general rule, I'm not sure there's an appreciation for the value that they get out of the data at this point. That's kind of been my general gut feeling.
Do you think in general, this is a general question, do you think our built environment targets, owners and operators, truly understand data, understand the value, understand everything that they can accomplish with good, integrated, interoperable data?
I think the majority of buyers want comfort in their spaces for the least amount of money, and they don't, and the value curve falls quickly after that.
I think it's the same as data. We were talking about iPhones earlier. I think people appreciate the data that's in the iPhone or in a Android in the same way. So I think we're getting used to the value of data, but we're not used to the value of data from a technology perspective of what data is. We're used to it in terms of how it's actually improving our lives. Right.
All our data is captured.
Right, but it's not about the data, it's about the use of data, which is essentially what Tracy was saying.
But what I'm getting at is that you can't use our data like you can use data that you can access with Android or iPhone.
Right, so
we're isolated from that loop.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the key things about looking at smartphones, iPhones or Androids is that they've figured out how to cram that complexity and make everything work with everything else in it. Right, and the amount of stuff is obviously enormous. We know that. So they've figured out how to make it all work, and through standardization and through other sort of mechanism.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you. I think the certain built-in things in the phone, like GPS, right? So location is something that once it's there, any application can reference it.
Yeah.
There's a common way to access a photograph, and sure, you can do it. You can have maybe a couple of different file formats, but it's very contained, and basically all these applications can come along and get quick access to all this common information and do something with it
At no cost.
at no cost. Exactly.
Yeah,
And
because
that's where I think we've fallen down as an industry. We're not doing enough in that area.
so Jim started talking about BACnet about 10 minutes ago.
Yep.
So there's obviously a role of standardization, both technology and, I would argue, business sort of process kind of standardization. Is that basically the vector of the answer to this question?
Well, actually, to expand on that, Jim, you said when you mentioned earlier that we started down the path with BACnet, got close, just didn't get there. What was the gap that you?
Well, I think largely we did get there, except for the gap was basically the stuff John's filling in with Haystack.
Right.
I think we didn't get the metadata all the way into BACnet, and thanks to John's efforts, we now have a metadata model. Now, you can always say that it isn't good enough and that we could do better, but it's good enough for a large suite of applications. So I think that's true. But what strikes me about this whole conversation, I was going to ask you this, Anno, on these new IoT things that you see, do the IoT things happen when the building is being built or later?
Later. They're always. I've yet to see them in a new install.
that means that they're completely outside of the bounds of the procurement
Yeah.
process for controls that I'm talking about.
That's really, really true.
And if you look at, if you look at my analytics business over the past 20 years, it's outside of the bounds. So if we look at sales models that we've used performance models, we've used energy savings models and other things to motivate those sales. And to some success, but the fundamental thing that we never talk about in this industry is the bulk of the money that is available to be spent on a building is spent on that new construction through those traditional channels. And one of the reasons that other things don't get to scale is the difference between the CapEx budget up front, which has lots of money, and the OpEx budget later, which does not. So that's why a lot of the IoT things remain small as well. And until the OpEx CapEx thing is the chasm we really need to cross to get a lot of this technology to scale.
Yeah,
So,
no, I
gentlemen,
agree. I'm sorry.
I'd like to bring up Anno's article, Anno, that you brought up about JLLT and our new BI platform, Azara. May not shock you all, but nothing from a BAS system is currently being utilized in that BI platform.
Oh, interesting.
Zero. So we have an opportunity. There's a huge
Well, that's a similar situation. If you remember, when we had a month talking about digital twins, we kind of realized that digital twin people doesn't know about buildings, right? Which to me was like an opportunity, that the skills that exist in this group and others has some potential use somewhere. It's the same as what you're saying, I think.
Mm-hmm. It has to go back to, Jim, I completely understand your frustration because I worked for a controls contractor, then I worked for a controls manufacturer, and trying to get in that specification, I'd rather go get all my teeth pulled at the dentist. I mean, it's a painful process, right? I get it. But somehow we have to disrupt that process and we have to re-educate. And it's part of an education problem. In my opinion, it's an educational opportunity that we have to somehow disrupt in the engineering firms that are speccing this out.
Which again talks to the whole consultants abandoning the space, right? Because that was part of what they were doing, a big part of what they were doing.
Well, look at cybersecurity that's coming our way, for example. If your business model before was, how do I have a consulting engineer design my building for 30 years to run and operate in an environment where the attack vectors are changing every 6 months, how's that going to work? 30 years from now, is that building going to be secure on the capital investment that went in now? Of course it's not. So, the model is going to be forced to change when building owners realize that they're going to have to spend money other ways. The question is how can we shape and surf that change as it comes through?
So, John, good that you're able to join us. You came in late, a little bit at a disadvantage. Do you have any thoughts about complexity and how we can get past it? Because the premise of this is that every time we get to a sort of a place where we can't get any further, somebody says it's complicated, then we all kind of give up.
Yeah, I read those comments, and again, I'm sorry I couldn't get here on time today. I question, what our conversations have been about and what our intent is. We hear about new people entering the industry, and they need to understand these things. And so I got to say, I was a little bothered by the fact that if we raise complexity issues, that's somehow considered a negative, right? Don't we want people to understand what they're up against? Instead of just happy talk. Isn't happy talk part of the reason a lot of the building owners, are in this situation? I relate to an example with somebody who's frustrated, couldn't connect our software to the system with BACnet, right? On a major, we'll leave the brand out. Oh, I know I have BACnet. It's right here on the data sheet. Yeah, it was an option. You didn't buy it, right? This isn't helping anybody, not talking about the complexities while I realize it may turn people off, right? And I thought one of the interesting comments in that exchange was, one of the allures of these parallel IoT only systems is they simplify one thing. They're not integrated. You can't do, combination stuff with, but boy, it's simple. I have my IAQ data or whatever it is, so, and yet on the other half, other periods of time, we're talking about how do we integrate it so we can intelligently do something with the IAQ data. So that's all I can offer is I'm concerned that we, are struggling of sharing the complexity and turning people off.
So you're saying complexity is a feature, even though
No, it's the landscape. It's the landscape.
landscape.
It's not a feature. It's the landscape we're operating in, right? It isn't simple. Sorry. Let's adapt and address what we need to do. And as I think we've been pointing out, and Jim just was, it feeds up into how these buildings are designed, what do consulting engineers do, who's educating the owner, so that it isn't the end of the road when the controls guy tells them about an issue that he hadn't thought of in the design documents, and he gets blamed, right?
Yeah. Where do we go now then?
I think what's
I want
going
to go
to
back to
Yeah.
I want to go back to Steve's point about how do we change the language. So part of the premise we had earlier, John, that when you're off is part of our challenge is the language we're using is arcane, right? This whole concept of points and things like that. And is it changing the language? Would changing the language help? Now we don't know what to. We're talking Greek, and we don't know should it be Roman or Thai or Vietnamese. Who knows? But would that make a difference? Are we still delivering the mass in Latin?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I would say it's getting more arcane, right? I mean,
Right.
There's half of the technology in this industry that I can't speak to intelligently. All of the networking and security stuff at the detail you need to know, it's more complex with deeper arcane language. Are we doing anybody a favor by trying to, whitewash that?
Words matter. Words matter. Words matter. And so I know there's never a situation where context can't be tweaked. To me, it should be like a piece of art or a symphony. It's ongoing. Context needs to constantly be recreated to then elicit behaviors and actions. That's all. So the answer to yours is, yeah, change your words, man.
Good point, Bill.
Okay.
And actually, we're also in a time where words, it's not just words too, because we have powerful things like video and that's what the IT people are a lot better at than us, is that they basically can present a thing that is very appealing and that basically makes you want to change and makes you want to go and buy their indoor air quality system. And we tell them about how don't go into those woods because it's too hard, it's too complex. Yeah, so,
Well, and I think again that's unfortunately we didn't have him today, but I think that's where James Dice is doing a good job, right? He is
Yes.
embracing the new approaches, the new words, the new technologies, and not new words. How to engage people, and so I applaud him heavily for doing that.
and you notice his following is a much younger following.
Yeah.
They are very vocal. The other thing I want to point out, I didn't do a good job of when I was doing my presentation, is this whole shift from the conversation from our industry up onto the social media is kind of amazing. If you actually start following some of these discussions, there's a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of different thought than what they shared here.
Pete just made a comment that owners, operators, and occupants want their experience to be made simple.
And did you see the comment right above that?
So let me ask the group this.
Okay, there's the problem. Keep it simple, stupid is not appropriate for intelligent building systems because they're not.
So let me ask this. Is there an unsaid trust issue between building owner and operators and the provider community.
Okay.
I don't think it's a trust issue as much as going back to what Jim Lee was saying, the inherent goal or built-in behavior of buying low. Right? So they want to make sure that they're not getting taken advantage of. So maybe that's a trust issue, but it's just about the price part.
Which is
What's
one
amazing
more-
is through their own ignorance, they're taking advantage of themselves. You know, I'm always marvel at a university that is saving money on low first cost so that they can pay it an operating cost over the next 100 years. And it's two different groups of people that never talk at all.
So as we're coming up to the top of the hour, how do we? What's our takeaway from this conversation?
I had one overwhelming thought here, listening to all of this, which is, can we identify what the problem or problem, create a list of the problems and really agree that here are the top 3 to 5 things that are stopping us from moving forward as an industry here? And
You mean problems with us moving forward, not problems with
make
building.
the complex. If we're focused on complex,
Right.
Is it our language? Is it the technology? Is it pricing? Is it what? Because I think if we can identify the issues, we can knock those barriers down one at a time. I think the problem is where we should focus is here are the specific things that we need to avoid. What do we start doing? What do we stop doing? And what do we leave alone?
I agree, Tracy.
Okay, maybe we can continue on this month, because this is what we're trying to do this month. Figuring out the enablers for moving forward, and that's basically one potential of doing that.
Yeah.
And I'm watching the comments go by. Another good one. And if John Petsy would have been here earlier, he would have said this, I'm sure, which is, remember, every big commercial building system is a custom built up solution, right? Always one of the problems that we need to figure out. And we've talked endlessly about how to standardize that solution and make it highly repeatable and predictable.
The other complexity we have is we drag all of our technologies from the last 20, 30 years with us. And the IT folks get to start with all brand new stuff. So they can go really fast and we have to go really slow. And ours is really complex because we're supporting 12, 15 systems. Is not uncommon.
But did we drag them, or did the building owners drag them by not being willing to replace with more modern technology? They replace their phones, their computers, their networks, but then they ask us to work with things that are 10, 20, 30 years old. We didn't drag them. They're dragging us back, and that makes it more complicated.
Which is to Jim's point that there's no money in the operating budget to replace these things with current technology.
And to John and Steve's point, the owners are culpable here.
Yeah.
We can say whatever we want about what we can do, but there is culpability on the other side of the equation. They're the ones that also don't change the business practice. They hire the same old consulting engineers. I think that really, while we do Tracy's list, which is an excellent idea, we need to examine the other half of the equation, which is what people are willing to buy.
One of the barriers needs to be customers don't understand how to procure this properly, or the best way to procure this.
Yes.
It's an educational thing, right? We say that all the time.
Right.
Because they have not been presented with an alternative to their default behavior.
Correct.
There, and even if we, what I'm thinking is, even if we can't come up with specific answers, I think we can get directional solutions or behaviors on all of this stuff, right? Like simple is better, repeatable is less expensive, and things like that. So then we can start to say, okay, how do we make a big, complex, custom system look like a system I would put in a restaurant after restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, right? So how do we do that? And there's a lot of activity going on. Haystack is a perfect example, right? Standards.
That's almost sort of commoditization, and That's something that's a somewhat of a bad word in the industry, and we're way past 4 o'clock, so we need to wrap this up. Thank you everybody for being here. We'll put up the video for tomorrow morning, and we'll be back next week to continue this conversation. So thanks all. Bye-bye.
Hey guys.
Bye.